Awareness Forum. We're beginning the presentation now, so we'll ask you all to take your seats. My name is Rebeca Morgan, and I am the Insider Threat Training Program Manager at the Defense CI and Security Agency's Center for Development of Security Excellence. I will be your facilitator today, as well as providing an awareness briefing. We'd like to welcome all of you who have joined us here at the auditorium, as well as those of you who have joined us online. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to help us commemorate this first ever Insider Threat Awareness Month. We're joined today by some guest speakers and distinguished guests, specifically the co-director of the National Insider Threat Task Force, Mr. Wayne Belk, who will be providing opening remarks, as well as Mr. David Paravecchia from the U.S. Army, who will be providing an insider threat risk mitigation briefing later in today's event. So, as you all may know, September has been declared National Insider Threat Awareness Month. The Department of Defense has partnered with OUSDI, particularly CI and Security's Insider Threat Program Office, as well as the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and many, many other insider threat and security practitioners from throughout the community to raise awareness of both the risks posed by trusted insiders, as well as appropriate responses to those, and the great work that's done by insider threat programs to mitigate that risk. So here to kick us off today, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Wayne Belk. He's from the Director of National Intelligence, National Counterintelligence and Security Center, where he is the co-director of the National Insider Threat Task Force. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Belk.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. That's the nicest welcome I've gotten all week. Oh, come on. Got to give me that one at least. No, thank you, Rebecca. I really appreciate that introduction. And I'd like to thank OUSDI, the Department of Defense, and all of our partners for inviting me to give this inaugural opening address. I really appreciate it. That sounds like I'm President Lincoln, doesn't it, the inaugural address? But this is an important event. This is the first time that we've actually had a declared National Awareness Month for Insider Threat. It's been a long time coming, granted. And I'll tell you, the task force had been thinking for quite a while about doing something like this, but like a lot of you, we found ourselves kind of strapped for resources and stretched a little thin. So we had kind of decided, this was maybe about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, we had decided to put that on hold until a better opportunity presented itself. And right about that time, I got an email. And that email was from somebody that most of you, like me, I'm sure, will recognize as the most energetic individual in the counter-insider threat mission space. Somebody who does a lot of good work for the entire enterprise, not just the Department of Defense, but across the enterprise, the entire government, and even beyond that. Right? In that email, she told me about an individual on her team, an intern, who had an idea for an official insider threat month, something that would recognize insider threat as a national issue. Now, I want to pause here for just a second and point out that that intern was from the Air Force. Anybody? Oh, wow, not enough Air Force people here. Work on that, Rebecca. Oh, by the way, happy birthday, 72nd birthday to the Air Force. A little belated, but happy birthday. You'll be hearing from her again in a few minutes, but for now, let's give Rebeca Morgan and her team a big round of applause. So in that email and subsequent emails and telephone conversations, Rebeca volunteered to kind of corral all of the organizations, to pull together the community, the insider threat community, to take the lead on building a communication plan that would get this ball rolling, that would inform all of you about the effort to make this a National Awareness Month and to get you involved. We didn't want this to be the task force running something. We didn't want it to be OUSDI or CDSE. We wanted it to be us. We wanted it to be all of us. And Rebeca took that challenge by the horns and has turned this into something that I think we can all be very proud of. And we want to see this grow, right? Every year we want to see this get better and better so that we can get the word out about what the insider threat mission is, what the insider threat is, and what these programs are about. So when I was preparing my remarks for this morning, which I rarely do, I usually get up and just talk. But I decided today might be a good day to actually prepare some remarks. And when I was doing that, I was going through talking points and presentations that I had given over the years on insider threat. And I was doing that in an effort not to find what to say, but what not to say. I didn't want to repeat myself. I didn't want to be saying the same things over and over again. And as I was going through all those talking points, if you've been in my office, you see I've got stacks of notes all over the place. And I've got these ubiquitous 3x5 cards that I use for notes. Right? I always have these with me. They don't always help me, but I always have them with me. But I came across this one in particular. I was just kind of lying there. And I noticed some words on it that caught my attention. The words are normalization of leaking and responsibility to protect. It occurred to me as soon as I read those words that I was taking the wrong perspective on this. I shouldn't be looking for what not to repeat. I should be looking for exactly that, what to repeat. That's what makes this message so important, this Insider Threat Awareness Month so important, is repetition of the message. Now, that begs the question, what's the message? So I've noticed too, and I'm sure all of you have, it's becoming more and more prevalent for some in our society to accept leaking of classified information, leaking of sensitive information, hurting our fellow workers, sabotaging our equipment, whatever the insider threat event is. That seems to be becoming more and more acceptable to some in our society. Now, I work in the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. I'm not a counterintelligence guy, and I try to pretend I'm not a security guy too. I want to do that middle of the road thing, right? That multidisciplinary thing. But I can't help but hear all the stories from the counterintelligence side about what our adversaries are trying to do. So to some extent, I think all of us are a little bit more, not accepting, but it doesn't surprise us as much that our adversaries are constantly trying to gain unauthorized access to our information, our facilities. Maybe it's even becoming more acceptable for them to conduct sabotage activities or cyber attacks or whatever that is. So we kind of get that. It's an us and them game. But not when it comes to our own folks, when it's us, right? Every morning I come to work, and I mean this literally, every morning I come to work. Before I can even settle into my office, 3 or 4 folks on my staff have already sent me articles that they found in the paper or online about another event, something that an insider has done, whether it's in the government, private sector, academia, whatever it happens to be. And every one of those articles is about somebody who had access to something that we want to protect. And they found a way to do harm. They found a way to ignore the consequences of coming in and attacking their coworkers, of leaking that one little piece of information that, well, it's not that classified, right? And that's every single day. How is that? Why are we becoming so accustomed to that? Why is that in the headlines so often? And at least as bad, my boss says all the time, and this didn't even make the headlines. That worries me. If I'm seeing all of that, if we're all seeing all of that, and then there's still stuff that's not even making the headlines, how prevalent is this? So we've also kind of, as a nation, maybe as a mission space, gotten kind of reliant on the catch the bad guy approach to this, right? Don't misunderstand me. Over the past however many years, the FBI and other law enforcement and counterintelligence organizations have arrested countless people who are committing these acts. Thank goodness for them. I'm not taking anything away from that. But if you've been in this mission space for the last 5, 6, 7 years, oh wow, Brad, we're getting old. You've heard me say on any number of occasions that our insider threat programs ought to be as much about helping the individual and protecting our workforce as they are about protecting information, classified, sensitive, or otherwise. Right? So again, I'm not taking away from the need to track these people down, these perpetrators, and bring them to justice. I applaud that. But we can't rely on that. We can't put all of our eggs in that basket. We can't rely on our ability to hopefully detect abnormal activity. Again, user activity monitoring, reporting from the workforce, those kinds of things, absolutely essential. I take nothing away from those capabilities. But I'm here to tell you, the message that we need to get across is we need to take every opportunity we can to deter this kind of activity. And a lot of deterrence is about helping individuals, helping them not get to that point on the critical path where they make that mistake, where they make that bad decision, where they feel like that's their only opportunity. Now, we all know that there are going to be those of us among us, and this will be forever, I'm sure, who for whatever reason, they know better than the leaders, they know how to create policy, they know how to protect the workforce better, or motivated by greed or ideology or whatever it is, whatever the motivator is. We're always going to have those, and we're not necessarily going to catch them all, okay? But I'm back to the point that we cannot rely on catching. We have to work on the deterrence aspects. So I was opening the Hub Operations course last week, and I challenged all of the students there for them to go back and help their organizations build insider threat programs that have whistleblower protections, privacy and civil liberties embedded within them, but to build those programs in a way that they are there to protect the workforce. Obviously protect all of the other sensitive and crown jewel type things that we have, but if you build it to protect the workforce, it will become a stronger program for protecting all of these other things. So my challenge to them was to go back and regardless of whether you're an IG professional, a security professional, a counterintelligence professional, a trainer, whatever your profession is or whatever your function is inside that organization, be a part of building that program in such a way that it protects the workforce. And even more importantly, message that. Message that to your coworkers. We all need to make that message clear. And this is the message that we need to be pushing throughout this month and every opportunity that we get to talk about what these programs are and what they're not. Get the perception away from Big Brother. Get it away from we're here to protect classified information at all cost. Individuals be damned. That is not the case. Take the opportunity to get ahead of the problem. Now, I promise not to take very long today, so I'm going to end it with that and turn this back over to Rebeca. Thank you all for being here today. Please enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you so much, Mr. Belk, for your comments. You know, Mr. Belk is right. Insider Threat Awareness Month really is about getting that message out there, not only the risk to our personnel, to our organizations in both the public and the private sector, but also getting the information about the role of all of you and all of you out there listening in identifying and reporting indicators. It's not just a role we have, it's a responsibility that we undertake. And I think we know this inherently. Every single one of us knows that we should be reporting information. We take the annual training. We pass posters in the hallway. See something, say something is probably the most ubiquitous phrase to anybody in this community, and yet we don't do it. What is it that holds us back from making that call, from sending that email, from walking down the hall? You know, some of it may be as simple as what we're taught as kids, right? You don't want to be a snitch, you don't want to be a tattletale, and that's ingrained a little bit. I get that. Some of us also may think, you know what, I see it in the newspaper, but that would never happen here, would never happen at my organization. Unfortunately, it does, right? So this month, we're also commemorating the tragedy of the Navy Yard shooting. We also remember the tragedy of Fort Hood and many, many other events that have occurred at both public and private organizations throughout the country. You also, as Wayne said, cannot open the paper without seeing another case. Harold Martin was just sentenced. Reality winner, Kevin Patrick Mallory, these names resonate. And when that insider threat occurs, however it manifests, whether it as espionage or another national security crime, theft, fraud, sabotage, workplace violence, harm to self or others, what we find is it's often in the very early phases those same indicators. So no matter how that insider threat turns out, very early on, those same behaviors and activities of concern are what we can notice, observe, and report in order to make a difference. I think one of the other things that prevents people maybe from making those reports is a misunderstanding of insider threat programs in general. What if I'm wrong? What if I report my coworker or my friend and they get in trouble for no reason? Insider threat programs are not designed to get anybody in trouble. If you're familiar with insider threat programs, as I know many of our audience here are, and probably many of you online, these are multidisciplinary teams that are designed to deter, detect, and mitigate risk. And as Mr. Belk discussed, that deterrence factor and that mitigation factor often come by developing positive outcomes for individuals. So the program really wants to get left of boom, or as Wayne said, get ahead of the problem. Our idea is to identify folks who might need a little help at one time or another and push them through so that they can remain in access, remain productive, have positive outcomes for both the individuals and for your organization. So how do we figure out what those indicators are that we need to report? I think we should start with the basics. So if you're in this room, look to your left, look to your right. If you're tuning in online, look in the mirror. That's an insider, right? Somebody who has authorized access. We're all insiders. What makes an insider threat is when that individual with authorized access uses it to either wittingly or unwittingly cause harm to an organization and its resources, which can include information, classified or otherwise, which can include facilities, which can include personnel. Now, when I'm describing the insider threat, I really find it's helpful to reference the movie Office Space. Have you guys seen this movie, Office Space? I'm seeing a lot of head nods, probably a lot of you out there online as well. If you haven't seen it, look it up afterwards. It's a good movie. This movie has a character named Milton. And Milton is just one of those guys. Super awkward, doesn't have a lot of really positive social interactions with his coworkers. He has a very unnatural attachment to his red swingline stapler. Throughout the movie, Milton also gives off a lot of indicators. He is disgruntled with his job, and he in fact expresses it to many, many, many of his coworkers. He's disgruntled because everybody gets birthday cake at the office party except for Milton. He's disgruntled and in fact experiencing some financial difficulties, which is another indicator because payroll keeps forgetting to issue his paycheck. Throughout the movie, people are very aware, but they don't report it and they don't address it. In fact, what they do with Milton is they continue to move him farther and farther away from all of his coworkers to where the end of the movie he is sitting in the basement at his desk next to the furnace. What happens at the end of the movie? What does Milton do? He burns the building down. Is that an insider threat? Yes. Is this the kind of guy that after he burnt the building down, every single person said, I always knew there was something about that guy? Yes. The reality is, in most insider threat cases, and I get it that hindsight is 20/20, but in most insider threat cases, those concerning behaviors were evident prior to the negative event. Everybody saw it coming. Nobody said anything. Now, I don't want to just pick on poor Milton. I don't know if you guys remember, but there's another insider threat in this movie. This insider threat is named Peter. He's the guy holding the baseball bat. And Peter is the anti-Milton. Peter is cool. Peter has lots of positive social interactions. But Peter also gives off indicators throughout the movie. He is aloof. He is disgruntled with his job. He gets to the point where he shows up to work, but he doesn't do any work. His coworkers are aware of this. He talks about it all the time. He also exhibits maybe some violent behavior. I don't know if you can see this slide very well, but they have taken a photocopier from the office out to a field, and he and two coworkers are beating it with a baseball bat. Now, I have spent 20 years working for the federal government. There has been a photocopier or two in my time that I have had strong words with. But this kind of behavior is pretty extreme and pretty violent. Nobody reports Peter. And in fact, Peter is often rewarded throughout the movie for his behavior. What does Peter do at the end of the movie? He sets up an algorithm, yes, where he steals about $1 million from this company. Is this an insider threat? Yes, it's an insider threat. Doesn't look the same. Very different looking, very different type of person. We don't profile in insider threat programs. We don't go after a certain demographic, a certain look, a certain background. What we're looking for with an insider threat indicator are behaviors and activities of concern, anomalous behavior. So we're not just picking on the Miltons of the world or any other class. What we're trying to pay attention to is those cries for help and distress, or indicators that somebody's going to engage in negative activity or is at risk to do so. And we'll talk about some of those indicators, but there actually is one more insider threat in this movie that I forgot to tell you about. One more. You guys remember this guy? Yes, right? Worst boss in the history of the world. He is clueless. He treats his employees poorly. There is no level of organizational trust within this organization. He's not transparent. He's not fair. Would you say, those of you who have seen it, that he facilitated those insider threats? There's a lot of head nods here, those of you that can't see it. Yes, because he failed to address the issues. This kind of poor leadership is also a risk for insider threat. And this kind of thing is something that can also be reported to an insider threat program, and often mitigation response. I'm not saying the boss is going to get fired. That's probably not going to happen. But there are ways that we can bring others outside of the insider threat program into that intervention process. Teach people how to appropriately respond to threats and risks in the environment so that we don't exacerbate them. This is one example of that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what other factors contribute to insider threat or contribute to vulnerability. There's something called the critical pathway. It was devised by Dr. Eric Shaw and his cohorts. And in this model, it talks about how individuals reach certain decision points as they go along. And individuals who maybe have a certain predisposition and then experience stressors in their life might reach these thresholds and move either down a critical pathway towards a negative event, or we might identify some periods of time where they can be diverted off, and interventions can successfully bring positive outcomes for them. What kind of indicators would come up, or what kind of events would trigger somebody to move down that critical pathway? Well, life crises, whether real or perceived, are things that occur in everybody's life. And some people may use those to travel down the critical pathway. What's a life crisis? Well, they can be in your personal life. We can be talking about divorce. We can be talking about death of a loved one. We can be talking about dealing with an annoying teenager who's just starting to drive. We can be talking about financial problems. We can be talking about stress caused by alcohol or drug abuse. We can be talking about undiagnosed or untreated medical conditions, including mental health conditions. And I see your faces. You're right. Those are not necessarily life crises. That's just life, right? Those are things that all of us deal with at one point or another. And there are a lot of young people in this audience, I'm warning you, those are happening to you too, eventually. That's life. Everybody goes through these various seminal events, and they're stressful, and they're difficult, and there are times when we're at a greater vulnerability to pose an insider threat or to move down that critical pathway. What an insider threat program does is reach out to those individuals, or hopefully they'll learn that they can reach out to the insider threat program and find ways to mitigate those life events. So an insider threat program is a multidisciplinary team. It's made up of CI, security, all the security disciplines can participate, information security, personnel security, cybersecurity is a big one, guidance from law enforcement, human resources, I know I'm forgetting somebody, mental health and behavioral science professionals. This group works together to help come up with resources and mitigation strategies that can divert somebody off of that critical pathway and get them back into a productive environment, foster a positive outcome, not only for them, but for their organization. The other thing when you hear me describe those life crises, and I talked about things like personal problems, drug or alcohol abuse, medical issues, etc., those sound a lot like the adjudicative guidelines. And if any of you, I guess all of you in this building, hold a security clearance, you know that these are the factors that are used to determine eligibility for access for a security or suitability clearance. You know, when personnel security looks at individuals, they take these into consideration, but they use what's called the whole person concept. So the idea being that a person is not defined by this one event that might have occurred, and a very human event that many of us go through. But the whole person is taken into account, as well as mitigating factors that might still make somebody eligible for a clearance, despite the fact that they've had this vulnerability. It's very rare that something will reach the level of a disqualifying factor that would prevent or remove access or eligibility for access. Insider threat programs work hand in hand to ensure that trusted workforce with a personnel security program. We help with those mitigating factors. The role of the insider threat program is to mitigate risk, and we do so by recognizing when somebody is struggling and doing everything we can, bringing those multidisciplinary forces to bear to get them back on the right track. So how do you know if a coworker, a friend, somebody in your area of responsibility or that you're aware of is going through one of these events or something is happening? There are a lot of different indications, and there's probably too many to list. We call them potential risk indicators. These are those observable and reportable behaviors of concern, and they're different for everybody. What you're often looking for is those that are behaving outside of the norm for themselves. And I don't say abnormal, because what's normal behavior, right? But different for them, abnormal. You all spend so many hours a week with your coworkers, probably more time with them than you do with your families. You can tell when somebody's off, when somebody's tired, when somebody's having a bad day, when somebody's having a great day. When you notice behaviors of concern and fail to report them, you're missing an opportunity. You're missing an opportunity to intervene when somebody might need it most, or if all they need is a pat on the back and a good to go, that's all they're going to get as well. But you're missing that opportunity to provide assistance to someone you know. Let's talk a little bit about some of these indicators. And again, there are a lot of them. I won't go through all of them, and they're going to be different for others. But we can cluster some in categories, potential risk indicators. So patterns of security violations for sure. Somebody who seeks to expand access, asking for information outside their need to know. Somebody who is reluctant to submit to a polygraph or other kind of security protocols, refusing to do so. Responsible for unaccounted for classified materials, trying to fish around and find stuff. Those would be indicators worth reporting. Again, this list is not all-inclusive, and you can find more detailed information on our website, cdse.edu. Also, suspicious behaviors. So things like working hours inconsistent with the job assignment, trying to be in the office when nobody else is there, coming early, leaving late, insisting on working in private without a valid reason, demonstrating exploitable behavior traits, and we talked about how some of those might contribute to that life crisis trigger. But there's very many behaviors and activities that could be exploited or make somebody vulnerable to recruitment or elicitation. Revealing unexplained affluence, so somebody who's flashing a lot of cash and didn't win the Mega Millions, that might be suspicious. You might have somebody who's experiencing the opposite, maybe extreme debt, extreme financial hardship. And again, that's something that people will go through at various times of life. But how are they coping with that? What's the stress from that? And what does that indicate as far as a vulnerability? Unexplained foreign travel or unreported foreign travel or foreign contacts, we all have that obligation to report that. You might also want to look at suspicious behavior surrounding legitimate and official travel and reported travel. Is it frequent? Is it unexplained? The destinations don't actually have to be foreign. If somebody is shuffling off to Buffalo every third weekend and they don't have Bill Seasons tickets and their grandma doesn't live there, why are they going? Now, does that mean that that person's an insider threat? No. If somebody's going through a life crisis, does it mean that they're an insider threat? No, not necessarily. But the risk is there. Our role is to mitigate risk. We can only do it if we know. Connection to foreign anomalies. So if somebody is associated with material that ends up, classified material that ends up in the media, or that would seem to give an adversary forewarning or foreknowledge of our activities, our information, our movements, that would be an indicator as well. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this case. So Petty Officer Second Class Brian Martin was arrested in December 2010 for attempting to pass classified material to an undercover agent posing as a Chinese spy. He pled guilty to 4 counts of attempted espionage and a host of other related crimes in 2011, at which time he was sentenced to 48 years in prison. Martin was 22 years old, sentenced to 48 years in prison. The indicators were there. Martin was accessing information outside the need to know. He was constantly asking coworkers to access information for him, to give him access, to provide passwords. Martin was continually borrowing money from coworkers. He also evinced some lifestyle choices in addition to his massive gambling debt, which was just one part of his life crisis that he was experiencing. He was engaged to be married, wanted to impress the father-in-law, was broke from gambling. He was looking for an infusion of cash. He mishandled classified information in the office. All the indicators were there. All of his coworkers were aware of his struggles. After his sentencing, Martin conducted an interview, and it's a pretty sad interview. He talks about just the devastation to his parents when this happened. One of the things he also says is, everybody knew I was struggling. Why didn't anybody say something? Why didn't anybody say something? Why don't we say something? We see something all the time. Part of it's maybe a fear, right? I don't want my friend to be mad at me. What if I'm wrong? What if they get in trouble? Would he have been mad that you reported him to the Insider Threat Program or security or your supervisor? Probably. Would he be serving 48 years in prison as a 22-year-old young man? Maybe not. This is the kind of thing that is happening in all of our organizations, both public and private. This was classified information. We suffer a devastating loss of proprietary and trade secret information in this country. We're experiencing economic espionage at unprecedented rates. We're experiencing those who would commit acts of violence at unprecedented rates. It's happening everywhere. In this case, we were very lucky. So it was an undercover agent. He actually didn't successfully transmit classified overseas. But imagine if he had, right? Programs that you work on, programs that you've dedicated your lives to, taxpayer dollars have been funding, programs that could endanger the warfighter if they're revealed, programs that could endanger the homeland if they're revealed. That's what's at risk here. And I know, I see you out there thinking, and you're thinking, okay, Rebeca, you're right. I should report that stuff. But I'll tell you what, life crisis or not, I know myself, I know my coworkers, we're stoic, we've got broad shoulders. You know, we can handle this ourselves. We don't need the Insider Threat Program coming along to pat us on the back and tell us we can make it through. We can make it through. Maybe you can, but the adversary is watching. The adversary is out there. The adversary is incredibly skilled at manipulation. The adversary is very capable of twisting your motivations, twisting your loyalty, and even when they cannot, the adversary is incredibly skilled at eliciting information from those who are unwilling to betray. And they're paying attention. They see these cases go down every day, and they know just where to target you. Every one of you is a target. Every one of us is a target. How do they know about it? You know, we all have such big digital footprints. How many people out here have a social media account of one form or another? LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. There's nothing wrong with that. We have them. It's a way of doing life anymore. Kind of have to have it to do business. And so long as you're practicing good cybersecurity, you have your privacy settings set, and you're aware of the signs that you may be being targeted or elicited, okay. Now, I don't have Facebook. I just never got into it. But I'll tell you who does have Facebook, and that's my mother. My mother is awesome. If you ever see this recording, Ma, you are the best. But even she would admit that she has a really, really big mouth. My mom once had an article placed in our local hometown newspaper that described my title, Special Agent Rebeca Morgan, who works at the Pentagon. She had my security clearance level in there, at least to the degree that she understood it. She named the town that I was living in at the time. Awesome lady. OPSEC is not my mom's forte. The other interesting thing about my mom, though, is that she is listed on my SF-86. That's the same SF-86 that was compromised in the OPM data breach. If you think you're good online, you're stoic, you can handle stuff, you all might not have my mom, But I guarantee every one of you and every one of your coworkers has some old auntie or some weird cousin Eddie or somebody out there in social media that is sharing your stuff. Whether that's your level of security clearance and where you're deployed to, or the life crisis that you're currently going through. That information is accessible. You are absolutely a target. You know what an insider threat program does? It helps you harden that target. So if you're being approached, elicited, recruited, we have a multidisciplinary team that can help you develop countermeasures to prevent that action, that can get you to the right folks to ensure that you're not doing anything wrong and that they're resolving it. That's sometimes if the adversary is targeting you. You know, more often what an insider threat program is going to do is harden that target by helping you build a level of personal resilience so that when you're going through any one of these natural life crises, natural events, you do have the power to make it through, not be targeted or approached, not move down that critical pathway to negative behavior, but really get that intervention and support that you need. And insider threat programs do provide that support. We've got that whole team, HR folks, behavioral scientists, the security folks, all working together to make sure that you can remain in access and remain a positive asset to your organization. I know sometimes people think that it's a gotcha. We want to get people out, fire them. We don't want to. You were expensive. You were expensive to recruit. You were expensive to train. You're expensive to retain. Believe me, we want to keep you, and we want to keep you safe. Again, you're a target, and it happens all the time. You know, these are just a couple of cases just from the last couple of years, manifesting in lots of different ways. So whether they're national security crimes, economic espionage, or trade secret theft, whether they are acts of violence, acts of harm to the self or others, repeatedly, those same kind of indicators are coming up. All right, I do want to give one little caveat here. I'd like to draw, if I could, a very bright line between a legitimate whistleblower and an insider threat. Insider threat programs, and indeed I think most of us who work in CI and security have a big respect for the whistleblower program. It serves a very valuable purpose. It puts a good check and balance on governmental activities. And there are very specific protocols and points of contact that you would go through in order to engage in whistleblowing. If you're not familiar with it, there's so much information out there on the No Fear Act, Office of Special Counsel. You can go through your IG program. We also have at CDSE, we have a toolkit on unauthorized disclosure that has a whole section on appropriate measures to take if you would like to become a whistleblower or explore those options. This is very different, however, from disclosing classified information to somebody outside of a need to know and then later calling it whistleblowing. It's not the same thing. You have to follow appropriate protocols. What's on the line when you disclose classified information, whether you think it's innocuous or not? You didn't make that original classification determination. You don't know what kind of sources and methods you're putting at risk. You don't know what kind of warfighter operations you're putting at risk. That information cannot go out. If something needs to be done to curb governmental activity, it will be done, and they take you seriously. They've always taken you seriously, but believe me, after Snowden, after Manning, after Winter, they will take you seriously. If you're not familiar, you don't know where to go, you've looked at the resources and don't understand them, reach out to your insider threat program. They will steer you on the right path to get where you need to go. Whistleblowers are not considered insider threats. I'd also say, for those of you who are maybe thinking of writing an article, appearing on a talk show, finally going to get that screenplay done, there is a process called pre-publication review. And this can be used to evaluate your materials before you get them out there so that we can make sure there are no inadvertent unauthorized disclosures. Again, we have resources on our website that can get you there. But if you have questions, reach out to your Insider Threat Program. That Insider Threat Program is a resource for you. This is a group of individuals who come together to really identify vulnerabilities, identify potential threats, and mitigate risk. They're not in the risk elimination business, okay? No matter how good your Insider Threat Program is, no matter how hard they work, and no matter how often you report, you're never going to eliminate the possibility of an insider threat. But you can manage that possibility, and you can manage that risk if you have appropriate access to the information and the indicators. Now, we're really lucky today that we're going to get a presentation about Insider Threat Program risk mitigation in action from the Army. So I don't want to steal any of their thunder. But before we bring them up, there are a few things that I'd like to share with you as far as resources that are out there. So if you want to learn more about the insider threat and you're not familiar with cdsc.edu, I encourage you to come over and check out our website. Go to cdsc.edu and navigate over to Insider Threat. We have a wealth of resources that can be used in your organization to get the word out. Case studies on some of the cases that we briefly flashed up there today. We have videos, we have e-learning. We also have what we call toolkits. And one of these is on vigilance and awareness campaign materials. So we are in the middle of Insider Threat Awareness Month, but insider threat awareness is all year long, and we have plenty of ways for you to engage. If you've never played one of our fun games, we have a trivia twirl, we have concentration, we have crosswords, we have word searches. Please log on and download some of these. We also have posters which are customizable, award-winning video campaigns, a whole wealth of resources that are really out there for you guys. Also, for those of you that are insider threat practitioners, we have a host of e-learning on topics such as privacy and civil liberties in an insider threat program. That's something that we take very seriously. We work very closely with many government organizations in order to develop that training to ensure that the insider threat programs that serve you are respecting the privacy and the civil liberties of the workforce. We also have training on hub operations, critical thinking for insider threat analysts, mitigation response options, cyber insider threat. We have two coming out, the cyber insider threat as well as behavioral science and insider threat programs this fall, so please look for those. I'd also like to point out that we have a number of resources on kinetic violence and kinetic violence response. So again, as Mr. Belk pointed out, this behavior has become so commonplace that we're almost inured to it. It's become normalized. Let's not get there. Let's not get there. Even one incident is too many. If you don't know how to identify the indicators that somebody might commit harm to themselves or others, reach out to the website. If you're not sure what to do to respond during an incident, reach out to the website. There's lots of resources culled from throughout the community, great stuff from FBI, Homeland Security, DoD, and others. So I encourage you to access that. Okay. So we're not going to be taking any questions during this live event. We will take them after the event has concluded. I'd like to now introduce our next group. So we have some great presenters from the U.S. Army that are going to talk about some real-life insider threat issues in mitigation. We have Colonel Mike Birmingham and Mr. David Paravecchia that will be joining us. So please take a moment to thank them for joining and welcome to the stage Colonel Birmingham and Mr. Paravecchia.
You got me? Okay. So I'm Colonel Mike Birmingham. I do the day-to-day management of the Army's Insider Threat Program. It's a broad departmental-wide program and also has a key element, a centralized analytic capability inside it that's managed by Mr. Dave Paravecchia. He's my hub chief. We're going to give you a little bit of insider threat conceptual overview for individuals, supervisors, et cetera. Then we're going to talk about specifically about what hubs do in mitigation so that you can kind of understand their role and how they play. And then Mr. Paravecchia is going to go over a specific case with you. So you have to get through the boring stuff with me before you get to story time with Dave. So with that, all right. Oh, there we go. Okay. So some key concepts in relating to insider threat. As Rebeca talked about, one of the first things you have to do to be able to mitigate any kind of threat is you actually have to see the threat. It sounds kind of obvious, but to see something, you actually have to be aware of it. You have to know what you're looking for. You have to even realize that it's out there, that it may or may not exist in your organization. If you're not looking for it, you are never going to see it. You're definitely not going to be able to overcome cognitive biases, some of just the inertia within you to not do something, to actually see something and say something. As we've seen, it's a lot harder to do than it looks on the poster. Okay? The way I liken it to is, in the newspaper or other places, they have these little puzzles that you do where it's what are the 12 differences between these two pictures? And if you look at one picture and the other picture really quickly, you don't see anything. Okay? If you're not looking for things like that, you will never see them. In most insider threat cases, people did not see the indicators. Or they saw them, but they didn't even believe that they were indicators. Or they saw them and they discounted them. Oh, that could never be something like that. So you have to really be aware of it. And every Sunday morning I sit down with my son and do one of these puzzles, the adult version of the Washington Post, not the comics version. And we talk about it and we do it together. And it's always better when two people are looking for the same thing. Everything is better as a team because then you can talk about it, you can remove your cognitive biases, you can figure out what's going on in different pictures. So think of it as that puzzle. If you're not even aware that you should be looking for that, you will never see it. And if you're not talking about it, focusing on it, you're definitely not going to see it. Because it seems obvious in hindsight in almost every single case. But in reality, it is hard to overcome those cognitive biases, the inertia, and the inability to actually recognize that a threat is, even if you see it. Okay. It starts in the hiring process. So in the Army's program, we've got 7 lines of effort. The first one is suitability. So a major effort of the Army is to check employees before we even onboard them. It looks at child care workers, guys like drill sergeants, sexual assault response coordinators, other people. So part of your insider threat program is before they're even insiders. Do you want to let them in the gate? It starts with the hiring process. The biggest thing we found that supervisors can do, honestly, is check your references. We found employees inside our program where no one checked any of the references before they were hired. So if the insider threat program isn't doing it, I'm pretty sure that it's going on across the government. Check your references. It will tell you a lot. Just calling an employee and asking, can you recommend them? Okay. Third piece, really, and this is harder to do, easy to say. What we found both with broad insider threats, workplace violence, if you think see something and say something is hard, once you say something, getting a supervisor or a commander to actually do something about a problem is very, very difficult. There's a natural inertia to just not do anything and hope the problem will go away. Because actually engaging early when these things are further to the left on the critical pathway, when it's a human resources issue, it's a personal problem, that's kind of hard to do, it's hard to mitigate. And as it gets more dangerous, the desire to not do something is even more, because wow, that's a big problem, I don't want to do it, maybe I can fix that piece by doing nothing, okay? It doesn't work that way. So don't just see something, say something. See something and do something about it. When you do something, you have to do it as a team. There's generally a hubris of leadership when you look at a problem, especially in the military and the uniformed military. I'm vastly guilty of this when I was a junior officer. There's a hubris that thinks, I can fix this problem. I'm smart enough, and it's my command, and it's my responsibility. I will fix this. These are not problems that one kind of person can fix. Generalists, supervisors, commanders, etc., are not subject matter experts in an array of very technical things. Almost every single insider threat has complex vectors, potentially multiple vectors, and complex motivations. And you don't fix those problems with a generalist supervisor thinking, you know, if I just give some hip pocket counseling, this will go away. You see this in a number of cases, very famous cases, where an individual, even if they did engage, they tried something, but they didn't get experts involved, they didn't get a team involved. So one person is not going to fix it, one person can do something, but that something that they should do should be gathering the team. When you look at cases, and the case that Dave's going to go over is a good example of this, is generally, normally, almost always, insider threat cases have a history. Almost never does something just happen. Somebody woke up one day and said, I'm going to be an insider threat. Or they went and snapped. My psychologist is bobbing her head up and down. See, I listened to you, Dr. Goldenberg. Okay? These things don't happen overnight. Whether it's someone is on Shaw's critical pathway where we've moved from precursors that are naturally in them to life events to stressors on them before we become an insider threat, whether it's an anti-terrorism case where there's a known pattern of how you look for information, do probing, do reconnaissance, do rehearsals, known pattern of how we do anti-terrorism. Whether it's a case of you have actually gotten away with this. Dave's case will show this. You have done something over and over and over again and gotten away with it, and then you may even start to escalate. There is generally, normally, almost always a history to this. Whether somebody was aware of the history and saw it, whether the history is in a data trail that a hub can access, it varies, but there's always a history of it. And because there's a history of it, and mitigation is complex, one and done answers are the worst thing you can do in many cases for the country and the government. There will always be a sequel if you do inappropriate mitigation. That problem is going to go somewhere. If you take someone and go, I have suspended their clearance, so I have moved them somewhere else, that employee is still in the federal workplace. If you have taken them and fired them or let them resign in lieu of firing, they're still going to get a job somewhere else. Just because you've done something with their clearance doesn't mean they don't have access to their network, to your network, access to your facilities, continued access to these facilities. People may have 2 or 3 affiliations. You may have a contractor who is a former Navy sailor who is also in the Army Reserve, who may also do work for another organization. Just because you fix your problem does not mean that problem is not going to appear somewhere else. So remember, there's always a sequel. And so in that case, what you really want, as we've talked about before, is you want holistic solutions. You have to gather a team, which is very hard. You have to get them all working together. You have to figure out the best way to do things and then move forward as a group to fix the problem. Hopefully, you have done that early enough where it is helping an individual get better and removing stress in their life, and you're being a good boss, not the one in the in-office space, okay? But at the very least, doing it before that threat becomes active and it impacts national security. But you can't do that alone. You have to do it as a team that's coordinated. So now let me see if I can get the button right this time. And the button's not working now.
There's a little button on the side.
Is that, oh, yeah, it's not working.
Nope. Nope.
Can we go forward 1 slide? There we go. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. We'll
Maybe
just put that down. So you got to be smarter than the equipment you operate. Okay. Mr. Paravecchia works in the Army's hub, a centralized analytical capability at the core of the Army. What do they do? It sounds really, enticing what they do in the hub. It sounds fascinating. When you go in there, it's really not that exciting. It's a bunch of people looking at computer terminals. Okay? But what they do is both difficult and complex and also important. Okay? So it's very important to understand what it is. It is not like it is in the movies. So let's go to the one we love to talk about in the insider threat community. It is not like Minority Report. We have no precognitives in the basement of the Pentagon. Little balls do not drop down with people's names on them. There's no giant computer machine that takes their place. It is hard analytical work done by not just people in the Pentagon, but a structure and an enterprise across the Army that is looking for threats reporting them, and then doing nitty-gritty analysis to triage through those cases, find the most dangerous ones, see what's most important, find one that we can actually action on, and do the analysis. It is not like all the movies you've seen about anybody doing any analysis for either in intelligence or law enforcement, where there's some person typing at a computer and they say, find out everything I need to know about that person, and they type four or five characters in and somebody's whole life history pops up. It's a fantasy. Usually the hub is dealing with limited information based on specific government databases, certain pieces of reporting, much of which may or may not be validated, may or may not be biased, and definitely is not complete. And the analysts that are in the hub have to come together from multiple backgrounds. We've got law enforcement, counterintelligence, personal security, NCO leadership, cybersecurity, a whole range of people looking at those things from different perspectives, talking about it and analyzing a case. They're putting those pieces together. And it is very, very difficult. It's almost like taking a puzzle and flipping it upside down and take half the pieces away and use the brown side of the paper instead of the colored side, and then trying to find the threat. And you get hundreds of cases, if not thousands of cases a month where you have to find those things. So it is not easy work. That being said then, information sharing is absolutely key, because once you find something where you've put some pieces together, you've got a threat that you could actually act on, where you've validated that information and you know some of it is really good. You then have to tell somebody. Hub's responsibility in many cases is information sharing. In the movies, you pick up a phone and call the FBI or call this organization, and then the star runs off and does something immediately. That's not the way it works. You have to have a holistic team. In a standard run-of-the-mill case that the hub works on, you will have 3 to 5 agencies just within the Army that we have to coordinate with for every single case. You have to call, you have to convince, you have to share data, you have to discuss, and then you have to focus action. And then those agencies, because they're centralized, have to call other people. It is very complex. So it is definitely not like the movies. It is a lot of just really nitty-gritty, basic human communication, basic leadership, and good old-fashioned analysis. The one thing that they really do well is highlighting the threat. So we talked about the awareness thing. In many cases, you'll find out that supervisors didn't know the information was out there. They had a different image because an employee had moved from one position to another, and now all of a sudden they're kind of tightening up their ship and they're looking really good. And the supervisor would never have known that there was a problem in the last 4 or 5 locations that they were at. It's important when an organization from headquarters Department of the Army calls from Washington to a commander in the field that says, we think you have a problem. Here's some information you should consider. How can we help you mitigate this threat with how we manage it? So the hub does a very good job with highlighting those problems to commands because of where we sit, who they are, and the access to that data. It's a wake-up call in many cases for commands. The other thing they do, we've talked about information, gathering the team. Even in some courses related to hub material, we say, well, we just refer that. We're going to refer that to law enforcement, or we're going to refer it over here. In many cases, a few cases, when you refer to counterintelligence, you do simply make a referral, and then you back away because very specific things have to happen that a hub does not need to be involved in and does not have the tradecraft to do. But when you've got a case that is complex, that is not specifically related to an active counterintelligence thing or an active law enforcement investigation, you have to gather a team. So not only do you have to tell many people, but then you have to get many people actually doing something. And this could involve civil law enforcement. So if you're dealing with a National Guardsman or an Army reservist or a reservist of any kind throughout the government, you may have, if you're dealing with a contractor, you have a couple then different government agencies that you have to call. You may be dealing with a state government. You may be dealing with local law enforcement if there's an imminent threat and it's a violence piece. So there's a lot of things you have to do to mitigate that threat. And you may not just be telling them, but you may actually have to be gathering a team to act in a case where something is more imminent. So you have to build that team and then get them to move forward, to go forward. And then the last piece is really important when you're mitigating at the supervisor level. What we found is, while we wish every employee in the federal government was an absolute expert on their mission, in many cases, the mitigating person, your employee assistance program person, the person who's running your sexual assault response program, your attorney who's doing your advising, your substance abuse program person, your counterintelligence team at a specific installation. Just because they have the title doesn't mean they're actually well trained or really know what they're doing. The hub is able to take experts, true experts at the national level, and when there is a gap in expertise at a lower level, help those lower level organizations out. Because we don't mitigate at the DA level, at the Department of the Army, at Washington level. There is a supervisor if they're civilian, there's a commander if they're a soldier, who has to actually do the hard work. And so the hub can actually enable those people by getting the right information and subject matter experts down to the field so that they can do the right thing with the right knowledge. Because in many cases we've seen that go wrong when they're getting when a commander or supervisor is getting bad advice. So, with that being said now, Mr. Paravecchia is going to lay out a story for you, a case. It's a very difficult case. It's one of the more complex cases that we've had, and it speaks to a lot of the things I've talked about in the last few minutes. And so, Dave, go ahead.
Thanks, Mike. I guess I'm on. So nothing like being the last briefer at noon in a building that has countless food options and a 2-minute walk. So we'll see how this goes. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. As has already been briefed, my name's Dave Paravecchia, and I'm the chief of the Army's Insider Threat Hub. As Colonel Birmingham discussed, the role of the hub is to look at anomalies within our workforce, whether they be military, civilian, or contractors, and conduct a holistic risk assessment to determine if they pose a threat to the public, the DoD, or Army information, people, or resources. If we can go one slide. Let's see. Maybe not. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to work off of this quad chart you see before you, and we'll kind of go through the different boxes. So the case we selected to brief for you today reflects the importance of our mission and the potential negative effectiveness to the DoD and the public. The individual was reported to us by one of our National Guard units. He was recently arrested in the public sector for impersonating a police officer. The individual was not in any official capacity at the time, but posed as an undercover police officer in one of the local communities. He was seen making a U-turn and pursuing another vehicle in what looked like he was going to conduct a routine traffic stop. It just so happened that a legitimate undercover law enforcement officer was in the area when this individual made his approach and did not recognize the undercover vehicle with which he was operating. When he followed him and attempted to intervene in the traffic stop, he approached our impersonator and kind of asked him what he was doing. Our impersonator became very hostile, told the undercover police officer to kind of back off, that this was his stop. The actual police officer asked for credentials. Show me your badge then. Show me your credentials that you're a legitimate police officer, and he could not produce any. And so the individual was taken into custody and arrested for impersonating a police officer. When he was going through processing, it was learned that the individual had military affiliation. And so the law enforcement entity passed on to the individual's National Guard unit that he had been arrested for impersonating a police officer, and the National Guard unit conducted a formal request for assistance to the hub to determine if this individual posed a greater risk to the organization. All right, so we're going to go through the upper left. Through research into his employment history, we realized that the individual had actually served in 2 other services prior to joining the Army. We made contact with those other service hubs and tried to get an understanding of how long he served for, what types of positions he worked in, if there was any indication of behavioral issues or poor performance, and if he had ever served possibly on a deployment outside the United States. It is here we also recognize that the individual had a dual persona, because he was also an active government civilian within the Department of Defense. We stayed in communication with all these agencies throughout the entire analytic process to ensure that the team, that being all the different hubs involved, had all the information necessary to make a proper risk assessment. Initially, the individual had a secret clearance, but recently had his clearance suspended and was awaiting final revocation from the DoD CAF. So we looked into what issues caused the individual to lose their clearance. Okay, now I'm moving to the employment history. So looking into the background investigation into his clearance, we learned that the individual had an employment history that spanned over 20 different law enforcement and security organizations in a very short amount of time. Most of these positions required the individual maintain a security clearance in order to be employed, and in most cases, he had the authority to carry a weapon. In many instances, he was employed for only 2 to 3 months at a time before seeking a new position. He had a habit of bouncing between government positions for a period of time, floating into industry for a period of time, something with the local community, back in government. He'd fall off the radar for a couple years, and then he was back again. And he did this, like I said, about 20 different times over about 18 years. In only one instance did he hold a position for longer than a year. This information highlighted a pattern where he would resign in lieu of being fired. Okay, and so this way he tried to prevent any negative or derogatory information on his SF-50 or anything he would have to place on an SF-86, and I'll talk about those in a couple minutes. In 5 instances, he had actually been fired from his place of employment. Anytime he left and tried to come back into the government, his initial entry point consisted of a falsified SF-50 and an SF-86 that lacked the full content of his employment history or where he had been. Okay, and so for those of you online who may not know in the room, you know, your SF-50 is a form that notifies personnel action and informs agencies of your employment history, your type of employment, positions occupied, and type of service. The SF-86 is a form that individuals complete in order for the government to collect information for background investigations, reinvestigations, and continuous evaluation of a person who's under consideration for or retention of national security positions. Okay? The form is required to be completed by military personnel, government contractors, and government employees in order to receive a requisite security clearance. Information required in the form includes the last 10 years of an individual's employment. So he had a habit of not including everything, especially once he started being fired from positions. Though this individual was able to be hired using some of these falsified documents, we all know that our HR departments take the initial documents, they process you, but then there's a digital footprint with these documents. And so when they do a digital scrub multiple times throughout the year to validate your 50 or your 86, we would find that the documents had been falsified from what had actually been recorded in the last position, and then the individual will be removed from employment and we start to bounce all over again. In most cases, he was fired for issues like disrespect, dereliction of duty, overstepping authority, and so those seem to be some of the trend lines we saw not only in why he was fired, but also when folks had gone out and were trying to talk to some of his former employees and bosses. Moving over to the concerning behavior part of the quad. So the individual also had an extensive criminal history. He had been charged multiple times for impersonating a police officer. And so in some cases early on, a lot of times we'll hire individuals to become security guards or law enforcement in the federal government. And in the Army, especially our civilian personnel, sometimes they don't always understand that their jurisdiction lies only within the confines of a military installation, base, or camp. And so I think local law enforcement sometimes get used to maybe folks think that they have law enforcement authorities off the installation, and sometimes being partners in law enforcement, they have a habit of just kind of saying, hey, you're out of bounds, kind of fix yourself, get back on the installation, you have no jurisdiction here in the outside community. But for this individual, though, because it continued to happen, law enforcement became aware, and then ultimately he was arrested and charged multiple times for impersonating a police officer versus just getting some of those early warnings that we had seen in his employment history. He also has a history of stealing police paraphernalia. And so previous employers reported badges missing, equipment missing, uniform pieces missing, and so that became something that started to trouble us as we were kind of assembling this case. Finally, the individual also has a history of domestic violence and communication of threats, which had occurred multiple times throughout his history. Okay, so what does the hub do? So after completing coordination with the other service hubs and working with the Defense Insider Threat Management and Analysis Center, our analytics cell passed their findings on to our behavioral scientists. So the analysts, They work up all the information, as Colonel Birmingham had stated, and they assemble it, and they try to sit down as a team and figure out what it is we're looking at and what are some of the things. And once we've pretty much kind of felt like we've been able to gather as much information as we can or what's allotted to us, we then take our findings and we pass it on to our behavioral scientists. The Army Hub is very lucky. We have a full-time behavioral scientist that works on staff. She enhances our capability to identify and assess the types of concerning behavior, discern unconscious biases, and provide additional context and insight into the social and cultural norms that may affect the resulting mitigation strategy we're going to develop for the commands. She reviewed the information and aided in case conceptualization. Questions, concerns immediately exist on the individual's judgment, character, emotional stability, amenability to behavioral health interventions, trustworthiness, and reliability. Aside from the individual's unstable work history, he had been identified as a subject in a criminal case or had been arrested several times over a 30-year history. Once our behavioral scientist completes her assessment, she passes mitigation recommendations from her perspective on the case to our mitigation cell, who begins to develop recommendations for the commanders or supervisors to assist both the unit and develop strategies to assist the individual. We've been talking about Shaw's critical path, and ultimately, at any point in time, if we feel we can positively intervene, then we want to make sure we're taking those actions too. Mitigation outlined a number of services, especially an evaluation to determine if the individual was a good candidate for therapy or psychological treatment and to assist in helping him break his derogatory pattern. The mitigation recommendations also outline potential force protection measures should observables, which we had already seen in his criminal history, begin to manifest in the workplace if the individual were to become violent or not, potentially some actions they could take to protect themselves. The Hub does not make employment decisions. Again, I think the beauty of what I love about the organization that I'm a part of is we are neutrally based, holistic, right? We're not emotionally tied to the subject. We're not emotionally tied to the managers, supervisors, coworkers. We are simply looking at what the data is telling us, and we are trying to come up with a strategy to help intervene and not only protect the workforce, information, and resources, but also try to take care of the individual. If you've ever been around the Army, you know that our biggest mantra is readiness, right? And so the Army has a mission, fight and win our nation's wars. We invest a lot of time, effort, training, and money in individuals. And if we can resolve the situation and keep them in good standing to continue to serve, then that is really our number one priority. Okay, so mitigation recommendation, so we passed on the recommendations over to the commands, okay, and then we ultimately await kind of what the decision is they're going to take. Throughout the process, our privacy and civil liberties attorney participates in the development of case information and provides legal advice where needed. Once each of the different cells within the Hub do their part, then it is passed again to our privacy and civil liberties attorney, who conducts a final review and validates the case meets an insider threat threshold, the case was handled properly, and that all the information collected is within our authorities. Once all these steps are complete, then I, as the Hub chief, conduct a final review and approve the case for further reporting and ensure that the mitigation recommendations that were developed and approved get passed on to the command and to the supervisor. Okay, next slide. If I step away, it'll come on. There it is. That's all I had to do. Okay, so some lessons learned. One thing, holistic analysis of complex, multi-jurisdictional cases can only occur when there are healthy information sharing relationships between organizations. And it's more than just having rules in place. I do a lot of outreach in my position. I do a lot of meetings and shaking hands and developing those personal relationships to facilitate the good work that needs to be done. And I will say in the community, especially within the Department of Defense, is top notch. Every Hub chief, every federal agency, every field operating agency within the DoD are all here to do the right thing, not only by the DoD, but also by the individuals involved, right? It's important that we not lose sight, like Rebeca talked about, on what the individual is going through as well, okay? Cases of this magnitude will always require assistance from both legal and behavioral health. The ability to pool resources too, as I talked about, all the hubs working in parallel to gather information and figure out what it is they knew or somebody knew is critical to processing these cases quickly. And so luckily this case did not become anything that spurred violence or anybody got hurt or anything, but it could have. And so the ability to get the information into people's hands who can have an effect, whether that's law enforcement, a commander or supervisor, is paramount. Recommendations to the command highlight several paths to address the situation. In this case, force protection recommendations, behavioral health and services were recommended. And again, commanders and supervisors are advised to coordinate with local human resources and legal entities. We do not get involved in employment decisions. We do not tell commanders what level of risk they can or cannot accept. So some of the impact. Obviously, in this program, we start to find where there may also be some gaps and seams in our normal business processes. So one of the things was in the hiring process. How do we have an individual who's got all this derogatory history, who has a pattern of leaving positions, he's known for stealing paraphernalia and police equipment, he's been arrested multiple times for impersonating a police officer, continue to get jobs working as either a police officer or a security person within the DoD. So obviously, there's something there. Again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the human resources departments were quick to find the derogatory and the anomaly, but even just going back to what Colonel Birmingham was saying, just in that initial screening process, we got to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. This case highlights, too, that the population we share with the local community based on where they reside or work and the importance of communication, right? So individuals who wear the uniform with us part-time are still active members of their civilian communities. And it's important that everyone who can assist in mitigation is involved. So in this particular situation, you know, I kind of did some research, and while the percentage of individuals who impersonate law enforcement is extremely low, the impact, though, to the local community, to public trust, to trust in law enforcement is severe. And if we cannot curb or prevent this kind of behavior, then really for all of us who ever get pulled over, right, on a dark night on a highway by an undercover police officer, you don't know what to expect or who you're about to deal with. And in most cases, individuals who do impersonate police officers are oftentimes seeking some kind of gratification. Many times it's theft, right? They may ask you to step out of the car and go stand by my car, and I'm going to go through your car, and then I'm going to steal maybe your credit card, your wallet, whatever it might be. Unfortunately, in a lot of instances, too, it involves sexual assault. Okay, and this is why, A, we felt this case was important to brief, but also why it was so important for us to handle the way we did within the hub. So thank you, really, for the invitation and the opportunity to present today. Unfortunately, 2 slides are not very reflective of the dedication of my team, who happens to be here in the audience, their professionalism, their countless hours that are invested in understanding an individual and determining ways to protect not only the organization, but also caring for the welfare of the employee involved. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I'll pass it off to Rebeca.
Big thank you very much, Colonel Birmingham and Mr. Paravecchia. Such a great case that you highlighted, and it really brings home a couple of points. One is that we can both have an individual response to a particular insider threat risk mitigation outcome, so address the issue that's happening with that particular individual, but also an organizational response where we perhaps get new security procedures, new processes. So I'm really glad that you brought that example to us today. We actually talked about a lot of great things today. I'd like to thank all of our guests. So we had Director Belk, Co-Director Belk of the National Insider Threat Task Force. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank our hosts today, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense, CIA and Security, Insider Threat Program Office, as well as their leadership, Mr. Gary Reed, who has been very supportive of this event. I'd like to thank the CDSE team and everyone else who joined us today. I really do want to encourage you to seek out more information on Insider Threat Awareness Month, cdsc.edu. I'd also like to mention that if you go to ncsc.gov and navigate over to the National Insider Threat Task Force, they also have a wealth of information that can support the programs for others. This concludes the live portion of the National Insider Threat Awareness Month Forum. I want to remind you that the threat is persistent, the threat is there all year long, and we hope that you'll continue to stay engaged throughout the year. I would ask that those who are within the audience to stay. We can do a Q&A session with our panel. For the rest of you, thank you for joining us. We'll be signing off now. Have a great day.